Welcome to the Faith and Liberty Talk Show, where faith and liberty meet. Our host is Dave Garrison from Ohio Christian University, a longtime Fortune 100 company top executive and a former U.S. Congressional Candidate from Texas. Our goal for the Faith and Liberty Talk Show is to give you an opportunity to listen to interviews and discussions with significant authorities and experts on subjects related to Christians engaging in the civil and political arena. The mission of the show is to give you real information and not sound bites that you can really use. We have a website for the show, faithandliberty.org. At this website, you can obtain more information about the show, our guests, subscribe to our newsletter, and become a friend of the show, and like us on our Faith and Liberty Facebook page. You can also access all of our previous shows. Please keep in mind that the Faith and Liberty Talk Show exists only with the generosity and support of our listeners. If our show is of value to you, we would appreciate you visiting our website, faithandliberty.org, and donating to the show. Now, let's begin today's show. Thank you for joining us.
Once again, we have a fantastic guest on our show, Gary Bauer, and most of you will remember Gary because he ran for president in 2000 against quite a field. Gary, I think you served in Ronald Reagan's administration for 8 years as an undersecretary and chief domestic policy advisor, correct?
That's exactly right. Yes, I was honored to do that. I, like a lot of young people in the 60s and 70s, I became aware of Ronald Reagan and was attracted to his conservative philosophy and tried to do everything I could to get into his campaign, and that ultimately led to some incredibly wonderful opportunities with a guy that I think is the best president of the 20th century.
I know that you've also served as senior vice president at Focus on the Family, which also you were president. Were you the first president of the Family Research Council?
Right. The Family Research Council was started as actually the Washington office of Focus on the Family. So I was there at the beginning when that happened, and over the next 10 years we built it into a fairly significant and influential public policy group in Washington that represents faith-based Americans on issues like the sanctity of life, traditional marriage, and religious liberty.
I think for most Americans, it was the Family Research Council and maybe the Christian Coalition that really got a lot of people interested in living out our faith in every aspect of life. And I appreciate all your great work there, and it was very meaningful. And now you've got a couple of roles, the chairman of the Campaign for Working Families PAC. And what is it that PAC actually does?
Well, as I'm sure your listeners know, and I know you realize, the country's clearly on the wrong track, and a lot of that is a spiritual problem, and certainly our churches and synagogues are going to be dealing with that and continue to deal with it every day. But we also are in trouble because we're just not winning elections, and when I say we, I mean conservatives, folks that are pro-life and pro-family. In the last 10 years, we've lost repeatedly two presidential elections. We've underperformed in races for the United States Senate. And so the purposes of the Campaign for Working Families, as well as some of the other entities that I run, is these are overtly political groups. We look for candidates for the House and Senate particularly who are pro-life, unambiguously pro-life, who are pro-family, who believe that marriage is between a man and a woman, who understand why religious liberty is our most important liberty and the one that the others are, quite frankly, based on, and candidates that understand that America was built on the idea that our liberty came not from government but from God. These candidates aren't hard to find, but when we do find them, we make a judgment about whether they are credible candidates. That is, you not only have to be a candidate with the right views, but you've got to show that you can actually compete in a congressional race or a Senate race. And when we are able to nail that down, we support those candidates and have had a fairly good success rate in recent years.
Do you do that support before the primaries or after the primaries?
You know, we've gotten into primaries, but only when the primary involved a clear choice between someone who's pro-family, pro-life, conservative, and a candidate that is, for lack of a better word, more of an establishment candidate
Sure.
who really doesn't care about those issues. Often, you know, we'll have primaries where there are 4 or 5 conservatives running. Some of the conservatives might be better than others, but we have found when we get into those races, we end up alienating our own donors because our donors end up being divided between those candidates.
You also are the president of American Values, and what is that? The purpose of that organization?
American Values is a conservative public policy organization. So American Values does not get directly, is not allowed legally to get directly involved in elections. But we do put out research. We go to Capitol Hill, talk to members of Congress about these various issues. We do a lot of interviews like this one, and op-eds and editorials, and we have a lot of things to educate the public on these issues, but we're not focused from that organization on specific elections.
One of the misconceptions I think people have is about PACs, and you're chairman, as chairman of the Campaign for Working Families PAC, you probably run into this. What is the maximum that you can give a candidate?
Well, the federal law is fairly strict. We can only give a candidate $5,000 for both the primary cycle and then the general election. What a political action committee can do in addition to that, however, is something called an independent expenditure, where we don't give additional funds because it's legally prohibited to the candidate,
right? And
we don't cooperate or coordinate with the candidate, but we are allowed then independently to do our own ad campaign or our own mailings that both support the candidate that we like and expose the weaknesses of the candidate that we are opposed to.
Gary, how does that relate to Citizens United, which a lot of people are now a little bit up to speed?
Yeah, Citizens United actually allowed other types of organizations, in addition to PACs, to do what I'm describing. So you can have a super PAC or a group called a C4 organization. This gets pretty esoteric for the average person.
Well, I know you have a law degree, so
yes. Well, in my defense, I'm not a very good lawyer. So.
Okay, neither am I.
I guess the bottom line to all this is that look, big unions have major influence. Big business has major influence. But it's been harder for just average people to join together and create organizations that they can donate to.
Especially faith-based people.
Right, exactly. And have those organizations represent them on issues of life and marriage and so forth. And that's what we try to do with the political action committees that we've formed.
And we appreciate that. Is that PAC open to all individuals who want to contribute?
It is. If your listeners are interested in finding out more, they can go to CWF, which stands for Campaign for Working Families.
Yes, and we'll put a link to that up on our website with our program for people to find, too.
Okay, CWF PAC.
And we'll also put a link to your American Values as well.
Great. I appreciate that.
And I think the listeners will also be interested to know that you are married and you have 3 grown children. We appreciate your family stance, and I know you're doing it because you believe in it, but also because you have a family that matters.
Well, thank you. Carol and I have been married for 42 years.
I got you beat by 2.
Okay. That's becoming rarer and rarer
these days. But we were 18 when we got married. But
Wow. And we do have three grown children. One daughter, a married daughter, works for a member of Congress here in Washington on religious liberty issues. We have a son who's now in Indiana working for Governor Mike Pence, a good pro-life, pro-family governor. And we've got a younger daughter who's married to a youth pastor down in Atlanta, Georgia.
Fantastic. Let me ask you, what was the takeaway that you had from working 8 years under President Reagan?
Well, President Reagan was in some ways unique in the sense that, unlike a lot of people in Washington, the closer I got to him, the better I felt about him. He was pretty much what people thought he was, a heartland American, a guy that sort of took a common sense approach to governing. He was strongly pro-life and pro-family and supportive of religious liberty, and it was a great 8 years. Now, I would remind people, and I say this only because there's a lot of rewriting of history going on. Ronald Reagan was forced periodically to compromise. I mean, he did face a Congress that in some of those years was controlled by the opposition party. He always fought for as much as he could get.
The 80-20 you always talk about.
But as long as he could point to something in a compromise that moved the ball down the field in the direction he wanted to go, he was and did periodically compromise.
But you say that as if it's a little bit of a warning. Are you concerned that people are not compromising or should be compromising in the current environment?
No, I think what I'm worried about is there's been some terrible things done by Congress, including some Republicans voting for bad things. And when that happens, I really, I speak out and criticize those votes, even no matter which party those votes are coming from. But I'm a little worried by every time there is a compromise, the rhetoric getting red hot, and people saying, "Oh, it doesn't make any difference who you elect." It does make a difference.
Oh, yes.
Who you elect, and anybody that thinks that a House of Representatives run by Nancy Pelosi would be no different than a House of Representatives run by John Boehner hasn't been paying attention. And I say that as someone who is not a fan of John Boehner, but I see every day bad things that the House of Representatives stops, that if Nancy Pelosi were back in charge, the House of Representatives would be signing off on.
Well, one of the things, and we have a large Ohio audience, and you mentioned Speaker Boehner. We're quite concerned. I spend about half my time in Ohio and half my time in Texas, and we're doing the show from a studio in Texas today. But I'm very concerned about I'm concerned about Texas and some of the Obama and his administration's policies. But I'm very concerned about Ohio, and I know there's going to be a lot of focus on Ohio, and we're trying to get Senator Cruz and Senator Santorum to a Faith and Freedom rally in March. But that's a state that we have to win, and I don't know. What's your view of the coming elections?
Well, I know a little bit about Ohio. I grew up in northern Kentucky, in Newport, Kentucky, which is right across the river from Cincinnati, Ohio. Look, Ohio is a key state, and when you go back throughout history and look at presidential elections, when Republicans or when a conservative wins the presidency, that candidate has almost always carried Ohio. It's very hard for a conservative to become president of the United States without winning Ohio, because there's so many other large states like New York and New Jersey and California that right now are predictably Democrat states, liberal states. So I worry about Ohio too, and I think in the last presidential election, quite frankly, Mitt Romney was defeated in Ohio even before he had actually gotten the nomination, because
Yes.
it looked like he was going to get the nomination, and the other side began running negative ads about Mitt Romney very early on.
Here's Bebo Norman for Compassion International.
Compassion's commitment to integrity is incredibly important to me, only because I, like many other people, can tend to be very skeptical of what relief organizations or what they're about or where the money goes and all of those things. And I just have seen firsthand what happens with the money that people give to Compassion and the time that people give to Compassion and the integrity that Compassion uses in that process. It is what makes Compassion effective, ultimately. And it's effective in terms of handling people's money. It's effective in terms of handling these children and their relationships and their life and their emotions and their education and all of those things. But ultimately, the reason that it impresses me the most is because it is effective in having integrity is what makes things that are spiritual effective, ultimately. There's no pretense. It is what it is. And that, to me, it makes offering the message of who Jesus is legitimate.
Make a difference today. Call Compassion now, 877-496-7016. That's 877-496-7016.
You are listening to the Faith and Liberty Talk Show. We hope you are enjoying this week's show. After a short break to hear from our sponsor, Ohio Christian University, we will rejoin our host, Dave Garrison, and this week's guest.
Ohio Christian University is one of the fastest growing universities in the nation, offering undergraduate and graduate degree programs fully online in the areas of business, psychology, chemical dependency counseling, nursing, and ministry. You can earn an accredited, relevant, and affordable online degree, all from the comfort of your home. Now is the time to prepare for your future and earn your degree with Ohio Christian University. Call today at 855-OCU-GRAD or online at ocuonline.com.
You are listening to the Faith and Liberty Talk Show, where faith and liberty meet. Now, back to the discussion with our host, Dave Garrison, and this week's wonderful guest.
Well, from my perspective as a dean of the School of Business and Government in Ohio, one of the things that concerns me most about Ohio is the lack of focus on social issues and evangelicals who are coming out to vote. And I think that's a shame. We have a lot of people in Ohio that complain about things, but in a quote by Senator Santorum that on our show the other day, he said, if you really want to change in this country, you've got to go to the polling place. You can complain all you want about it, but unless you go and vote, you have no room to complain. And that's one of the things that concerns me. There were people in Ohio sitting in churches and having a conservative stand and said, well, I'm not voting for Romney because he's a Mormon or this or that. What do you say to believers who have that opinion?
Well, it's tragic. I have to tell you, I wrote a book with Dr. James Dobson called Children at Risk.
Right,
and,
great
worked
book.
With him. Thank you. Worked with him for many years. And I have to tell you, one of the things that both he and I found most discouraging was not the regular hate mail from the gay rights movement or the radical pro-abortionists or the various atheist organizations, but mail we would get from fellow Christians telling us we were wasting our time and why were we fighting back against these things, that it was all part of God's plan and all the rest of it. And I can't even tell you not only how discouraging that was, but how unbiblical it is. Of course, God has a plan, but the whole scriptures are a message of heroes and heroines of the Bible fighting back against evil. Mm-hmm. So I don't understand it when I see the really real persecution of Christians around the world, and then I look in America where we have minor persecution. Fortunately, and that must be resisted. But we still live in a country that is free, in which we've got freedom of speech, freedom to worship, freedom to be active citizens, and so many believers are sitting on their hands, are ignoring issues, are not getting involved in the country's public life. And when you do that, you leave your country to groups and organizations that have a quite different vision of what they want America to be. And I'm afraid if we keep doing this, we are going to end up with persecution because the folks we're fighting against will not be satisfied just to promote their agenda into law eventually, and we're already seeing signs of that. They will try to force us to cooperate with an agenda which, as believers, we cannot and must not cooperate with.
Yeah, and as a lawyer, we were always trained to talk about the slippery slope, and I think that's one of the situations we're in. When I interviewed Newt Gingrich and Ralph Reed and Senator Santorum, I asked them about how optimistic they were towards the future of America, and all of them are concerned about the same thing. How optimistic are you about the direction of the country?
Well, we were talking about Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan was known for being an optimist, and I had some pessimistic tendencies, but he scared them out of me because I watched him fire pessimists. So I try to be optimistic, but it's getting harder and harder. There's no question about it. The trend lines are not good. Now, having said that, I am encouraged in the last literally 5 weeks with what appears to be a shift in the public about some of the things going on in Washington, and the shift appears to be in a more conservative, traditional direction.
The surveys are showing that.
Yes. So we'll see if that lasts, until the elections in 2014, where we have a real opportunity, if we can get the United States Senate back, to at least on some of these political issues, public policy issues, start moving the country back in the right direction.
Yes, and I've talked to just about every speaker that's a guest speaker of ours who have been involved in politics about something else that really troubles me, and you alluded to it, and that's the letters that you've gotten at Focus on the Family and probably still get, and I've gotten some myself who will say Christians should stay out of politics, stay out of those issues. And when I'd talk to pastors, and I'd ask them about, well, what subjects do you cover from the pulpit? Do you talk about abortion? Do you talk about same-sex marriage and various other social issues? And they say, oh, no, those are political issues, and we need to stay away from those things because they're divisive. And we as Christians have been called not to be divisive, and we want unity. What do you think of that view?
I think it's disastrous for the country, and I think it's unbiblical. Look, when as Christians we look back on history, some of the most shameful moments in the history of the church has been when the church followed the kind of advice that you just indicated some pastors give when they're asked about these issues. I mean, it still breaks my heart to read about what happened, for example, in Nazi Germany, when certainly some Christians did resist, some Christians hid Jews and were very proud of those that stood up. But most German Christians were good Germans before they were good Christians. And they not only cooperated with Nazism, they literally brought the crooked cross of Nazism, the swastika, right into the churches to display next to the cross of Jesus Christ.
Yeah.
You could go back to the 1840s and 1850s in the United States, where all too often churches throughout the United States, but particularly in the South, refused to speak out against the degradations of slavery. And we look back on that and say, how could they have been silent about that issue? Lincoln used to complain that when he would go to church leaders and ask them to speak out against slavery, they would tell him that they weren't going to do it because it was a political issue and they didn't want Lincoln bringing politics into the churches. And then he would speak out against slavery in political debates, and politicians would say to him, that's a moral issue. Quit bringing morality into politics. So, no, look, I mean, I don't expect the pastor to, every Sunday rail against abortion. But we worship a God who says, I set before you life and death, so choose life so you and your children may live. The message, Christ's message, the biblical message, is certainly a message that is without contradiction, a message about the sanctity of human life, that all human beings are made in the image of God, and whether, regardless of the color of their skin, whether they're handicapped or an 80-year-old with senility, they all have dignity and value and worth.
Yeah.
And if a pastor's not preaching about that, then he's missing one of the key messages of Christ's ministry.
How true.
Rebecca St. James for Compassion.
I think one of the big issues that I see in my own life, and I just see in young people, is this common selfishness. It's a complete battle to not live for self, because everything is saying, Rebecca, if it makes you feel good, do that. Please yourself. The culture is encouraging that in such a huge way. And I think compassion is an amazing way that we can be encouraged to live beyond ourselves. It's not about us, It's not about how we feel. It's more about serving Him and showing His love to a hurting world. And through compassion, you really actually get to see the need. Here is a huge need, and I can make a difference one child at a time.
To sponsor a child or to learn more, call Compassion now, toll free 877-496-7016. That's 877-496-7016.
You are listening to the Faith and Liberty Talk Show. We hope you are enjoying this week's show. After a short break to hear from our sponsor, Ohio Christian University, we will rejoin our host, Dave Garrison, and this week's guest.
Ohio Christian University is one of the fastest growing universities in the nation, offering undergraduate and graduate degree programs fully online in the areas of business, psychology, chemical dependency counseling, nursing, and ministry. You can earn an accredited, relevant, and affordable online degree, all from the comfort of your home. Now is the time to prepare for your future and earn your degree with Ohio Christian University. Call today at 855-OCU-GRAD or online at ocuonline.com.
You are listening to the Faith and Liberty Talk Show, where faith and liberty meet. Now, back to the discussion with our host, Dave Garrison, and this week's wonderful guest.
I think Christians are beginning to pick up a little bit on the harm to their religious liberty. And one of the areas that I know you guys focus somewhat on, or not somewhat, quite a bit on, that really troubles me, because working at USAA, where I retired, we were very focused on the military. What do you see happening to religious freedom in the military? And I know there's a video, listeners, that you should see on the American Values website about this. But Gary, I'd appreciate your thoughts on this.
Yes. Well, in the last, in recent years, and it's accelerated in the last 5 years, there has been a very aggressive effort in the United States military to limit the religious liberty rights of members of the armed forces.
Where's that coming from?
Well, I think particularly the acceleration of it is coming right out of the Obama Whitehouse. Any president gets to put key officers in positions of authority in the Pentagon. President Obama has done that, and plus his political appointees at the Pentagon share this same worldview. So we are getting regular cases where curriculum is being used to train members of the military, curriculum that tells them that conservative groups are bigoted groups and cannot be used as a source of information. We've seen chaplains told that they can't speak out about certain issues, whether it's life or marriage. We've had efforts to force chaplains to participate in same-sex marriages, or to no longer counsel members of the military that may be wrestling with homosexual impulses. Those chaplains have been told they can no longer tell those members of the military that through God they can avoid those temptations.
Isn't it also that they've been, well, it's gone back and forth, I know, but not proselytizing, not leading people to Christ?
That's exactly right. There's an ongoing battle on something as fundamental as that. These are disturbing developments, and if they continue, I think the American military would find out that they would have a very hard time getting recruits, because disproportionately the families that raise their children with the patriotic values and the attitudes about America, those households disproportionately tend to be faith-based households.
Well, this just occurred to me, Gary, and I'm going to try it out on you because of your great policy mind. But what kind of recruits are they going to get if they get recruits who are not faith-based, we'll say, because the faith-based say, well, I'm not joining that sort of organization, when the military has always been focused on honesty, loyalty, service, virtue, just all those different character qualities. Don't you think that would hurt the military?
Well, absolutely. I mean, you've made a key point here. You certainly know, as your listeners do, that another problem the military is wrestling with is sexual harassment within their ranks. Well, who's going to be less likely to treat female soldiers badly? It would be people that take their Christian faith seriously and are taught to always treat women with respect and with dignity. So in every aspect of American life, whether it's business or education or the military, we're seeing what happens when there's a breakdown of reliable standards of right and wrong, and we see what's happening as our country moves further and further away from Judeo-Christian values.
Well, my perspective on the military and faith, having sat with many 3, 4, all sorts of star generals and listened to their disdain for the Department of Defense, I don't think the military willingly brings that stuff on themselves. I don't think it's coming from the military. I think it's coming from the administration. So.
I agree completely. Some of the best people I know are in the U.S. military. We
Absolutely.
are big supporters of our men and women in uniform, and particularly those that have fought in defense of American liberty. Interestingly, my church is that our family goes to is in Northern Virginia, and it's known as a Pentagon church because so many members of the church, in fact, are officers at the Pentagon. And I can tell you they are as upset as you and I are about the pressure they're getting, political pressure they're getting in the Obama administration.
On your video that's on your website, the people who are talking on this military freedom video, they're blacked out so that you can't recognize their faces, and their voices are distorted so you can't recognize their voices. Why did you or they feel that they had to do that?
We've had, unfortunately, cases where officers in the military have spoken up about some of these issues and have ended up being disciplined or demoted as a result of their involvement. We've even had a case where an individual in the armed forces wrote an article, as I recall, for a military magazine or newsletter, or it may even have been a speech he was giving, in which he said this old truth that I'm sure you've heard many, many times, that you don't find many atheists in foxholes. And what that saying means is that even people that aren't very religious, if they find themselves in the middle of hostilities and they're in a foxhole and somebody's trying to kill them, guess what? People find God under those circumstances. So that's all the officer was saying when he quoted that. Well, his superior officer, again under pressure, I'm sure, from people above him, said that quote was hostile to those people in the military that were atheists, and this officer was disciplined for saying something that has been said for years, and in fact, I believe it was originally said by Dwight David Eisenhower.
When I talked with Senator Santorum, and we talked about the Air Force taking down that nativity scene,
Yes.
because it was offensive to atheists. And the point that I made to him, and he later that evening made the same point on Fox News, was every time we drive down the street, I'm offended by something. When I see the billboards, every time I turn on network television, I'm offended by something. If atheists or people of that ilk are so offended by all of this stuff, what about the rest of us? I just told Senator Santorum that they just need to put on their big boy pants and get over it, because we can't have a life without offending things. And I don't believe them when they say that. I think they just think that is the hook that gets them in there.
Well, you're exactly right. You know, a lot of Christians have bought into this mantra of tolerance, and that's been interpreted to mean that if something we say or do or display offends somebody, that somehow that's intolerant toward them, and we have to stop our speech. We have to edit what we're writing or what we're saying because it might offend somebody else. Well, I think what we will see, and we're already seeing, is that no society has that as their standard. Every society chooses a set of values that it promotes. And I believe the mantra of tolerance is being used, quite frankly, to silence particularly conservative and traditional Christians.
Because, why, Gary? Because of our view that...
Well, because of our view about God, our view about what God teaches about life and about marriage and so forth.
And our kindness and our goodness. And
exactly.
We as Christians, we want to love, and they know that, and so they take advantage of that.
Yeah,
in my perspective.
You're absolutely right. I was, interestingly enough, I was in Indiana last weekend, and as I was driving to the airport, I looked over to the right and saw a big billboard that said millions of Americans are living happy lives without God. Call this 1-800 number to find out how you can too.
Oh,
I found that deeply offensive. There's nothing
and also
I can
stupid.
do about it. Exactly, it is stupid. But if you tried to put up an overt religious Christian billboard, I'll guarantee you somebody will try to censor you and prevent you from doing it.
You know, I'm okay with the marketplace of ideas to a certain extent. Senator Santorum said something in our interview that I knew the minute he said it, I was going to try it out on you. He says, we have to stop rolling over and playing dead as if they, meaning liberals and particularly atheists and those that push that agenda, are the ones that ultimately get to decide. We need to start fighting for our rights and need to go to court. We need to fight for those beliefs, and we need very peaceable but very important and principled civil disobedience. Are you a supporter of civil disobedience, and if so, when and how?
You know, this is interesting that you would bring it up because in recent months, in a daily report I send out, email report I send out, I've raised the issue of civil disobedience a couple of times because I think that is where we're headed, and it's a tactic that has been used very effectively by very honorable movements in this country since our founding, and I think it's something that Christians should prayerfully consider. Let me give you one quick example of how an individual can engage in a form of civil disobedience and make a difference. We've had Christian students who have graduated at the top of their classes, their high school classes. They get selected as a result to deliver the graduation speech, and they have been warned by principals and school boards that in those speeches they cannot mention God, they cannot say anything religious, because that would be a violation of the separation of church and state. Often, those young people will just meekly go along, but every once in a while, we will hear about a case, and it's happening more frequently, where the student just gets up and says, I want to begin by thanking my family for all the support that they gave me and by thanking God because without my faith and my family, I would not have had the success I've had in high school. And every time that's happened, the audiences have erupted in boisterous applause.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
But that is a form of civil disobedience. In some cases, those students have been punished by having college recommendations withdrawn and so forth. But I think what they did was noble, was within the spirit of American liberty, and also was very consistent with our Christian faith.
Michael W. Smith for Compassion.
I cannot begin to tell you how crazy I am about compassion. I don't get involved in too many things, but I'll never forget 13 years ago I got asked to be involved with compassion. And if I'm not mistaken, I think my answer was no, because I didn't know anything about them. But I said, I'll tell you what I'd love to do. I would love to sponsor a child, and then I would like to go see what you do. I'll never forget my first trip to Ecuador. It was just life-changing. I don't know if you've ever been to a third world country, but at some point, if you ever have a chance to go, it will change your life. But I went and saw Compassion's work and what they did nutritionally for the kids and then educationally. And then the most important thing was that they shared the gospel with these kids. And I'm convinced that there's hundreds of thousands of kids who have come to know Christ in a personal way through Compassion sponsorship program.
To sponsor a child or to learn more, call Compassion now, toll free 877-496-7016. That's 877-496-7016.
You are listening to the Faith and Liberty Talk Show. We hope you are enjoying this week's show. After a short break to hear from our sponsor, Ohio Christian University, we will rejoin our host, Dave Garrison, and this week's guest.
Ohio Christian University is one of the fastest growing universities in the nation, offering undergraduate and graduate degree programs fully online in the areas of business, psychology, chemical dependency counseling, nursing, and ministry. You can earn an accredited, relevant, and affordable online degree, all from the comfort of your home. Now is the time to prepare for your future and earn your degree with Ohio Christian University. Call today at 855-OCU-GRAD or online at ocuonline.com.
You are listening to the Faith and Liberty Talk Show, where faith and liberty meet. Now, back to the discussion with our host, Dave Garrison, and this week's wonderful guest.
The couple that owned the bakery, and they were recently, in the last, 10 days or 2 weeks, the judge ordered them to make the cake for the gay couple.
Right.
Now, what is your advice to that couple?
Well, I want to be careful here to not give easy advice if it's not my neck that's on the line and it's somebody else's neck that's on the line. But certainly, if they believe, and I see why they do believe this, that cooperating in any way with a same-sex marriage is contrary to their faith, then I think when you have, from that standpoint, an unjust law, one of the things you can consider, and one could argue, one of the things you're required to do is to not give to Caesar something that can only belong to God, and that would mean ignoring the order to participate in that same-sex wedding by providing the cake for the wedding or whatever it is. These will be difficult things to sort out for people, and certainly will be difficult things for churches to figure out. But I think if the culture keeps going in the direction we're going in, we're going to find more and more that we're required to do this. By the way, the bigger example is the Obamacare, which is trying to force faith-based institutions to subsidize abortion, after morning pills, sterilization pills, etc.
And the lack of conscience protection as well.
Exactly. And we have seen numerous Christian institutions, most vocally Catholic churches and Catholic charities speaking up, and some of them saying we will go to jail before we cooperate in that order.
It's unfortunate that our country has kind of gotten to this point that these sorts of things are going on. But I think if I were the two bakers, I would bake them a cake, but you ought to see what kind of cake I'd bake them. But anyway, that's another story.
Yes.
Now, let's go a little bit different direction, but it's probably still part of the same. As a Christian, and as you look at America, what do you feel, and I'm going to give you some examples of what people have told me, what do you feel are the most pressing issues in America? When I interviewed Matt Staver, who I know you know, he's the president of the law school there at Liberty University, he thought this push for gay marriage, this gay rights, and the way they do it was one of the most pressing issues. I talked to a Star Parker who feels like the welfare has enslaved Americans, particularly African American. I'll talk to others, and they think it's the financials. Others think it's a worldview, or others will think it's the media and the educational elitists. I don't call them elites because they don't have any real power other than locally. But what do you think are the most pressing issues?
You know, it's a sign of our times that there's so many things to choose from. We're obviously in deep trouble. You know, I guess I would summarize it with the fact that on almost everything you mentioned, the core cause for all of those things is this effort to rip us away from our Judeo-Christian roots. This whole country was built on the values of Judeo-Christian civilization. Our founders on the way to Constitution Hall, they were very learned men. They were very well-read men. They weren't reading the Quran on the way to Constitution Hall. They weren't reading the Washington Post or the New York Times.
But I learned recently, Gary, that they were very aware of the Quran.
Yes, they were.
And if we think about Thomas Jefferson at the beginning of his term as president, he was having to fight all the piracy and the killing from Islamic countries over there. So it's something that's been bothering us for a long time. I had to insert that. Sorry.
No, I'm glad
Please go
did.
on.
I'm glad you did. You're absolutely right. No, this country was built on religious liberty. It was certainly built on the idea that you didn't have to be a believing Christian or a believing Jew to be part of America. And that was one of the wonders of it. But there was no doubt that it was the core ideas, particularly the notion that we are made in the image of God, that was the basic idea of America. It's why the founders referred to us with a biblical phrase, a shining city on a hill. To the extent that we abandon the values of Judeo-Christian civilization, we will end up with bigger and bigger government, more and more regulations, more and more corruption on Wall Street, in Washington, D.C., in our own communities. So this is a core battle that we're in the middle of. And if we can get back to those Judeo-Christian roots, we're going to win the battles on marriage and on the sanctity of life and some of the other issues. If we continue to abandon those core beliefs of Judeo-Christian civilization, America as we know it and understand it will be lost.
Someone I'm trying to get on the show here is Dr. Frank Luntz, and he has written the book, Words That Work. Additionally, he did the preparation for Governor Romney when he was debating, as well as Santorum and various others. And he argues that the words that we use as conservatives, we need to really think more carefully about that, because the other side will use those words. They call it pro-choice. And that sounds so good. We call scholarships for different schools, we call it vouchers. And we tend to not use the words. Do you think conservatives have a little bit of that problem of not understanding how we're communicating, and we need to be a whole lot better at it?
We've got so many problems we would need a couple of days to go over them all, but one of them is certainly this failure to communicate, or laziness in communicating, where
I guess it's because I'm a college professor too, these days, that I notice how badly words are being used.
Yes, and look, the other side is very adept at this. You will notice President Obama using certain words over and over and over again, he will use the word fair over and over again, because when you poll the word fair, virtually every American is in favor of fairness. Surprise, surprise. The problem is he uses the word and applies it to things that are decidedly not fair, but it rings a bell with the listener when they hear the president or any politician say, "Look, we've got to stop doing such and such. It just isn't fair." We've got to be much more adept at using those words. One of the great strengths of Ronald Reagan was he had just a natural instinct to talk the way average Americans talk, and often made his point by telling little vignettes, little stories, which is a great way to win a public policy argument. Don't talk like you're a policy wonk that lives all of his life inside the Washington Beltway. Talk like your neighbor does, or the guy that you sit down on the weekend and have a barbecue with.
Well, I think that was something that George W. Bush did a really good job, and why he was so popular, particularly here in Texas, because there is a way that we talk, and I think they appreciate it. Now, we're just about out of time, but I wanted to get into one other area, which, as your involvement with Focus on the Family and Family Research Council was very concerned about, and that's education. I think you were still at Focus on the Family when they did that great big study on home education and found out homeschooling, how well the 5,500 in the survey had done compared to the general population, that homeschoolers and private Christian schools are doing a fantastic job of educating people. But one of the concerns that a lot of us have is how many young people go off to college, and you can debate it, but they so-called lose their faith. So do you believe that the mainstream education in the U.S. is brainwashing our children? And if so, what should people do about it, or should they even worry about this?
Well, they should worry about it a great deal. I frequently get letters from parents that are heartbroken because a son or a daughter that they spent their whole lives raising with the right values gets sent off to college, where professors tell that son or daughter that everything their parents believe is bigoted, old-fashioned, out of date, wrong, intolerant, etc. And then that child comes home and the parents are heartbroken. So I think one thing that every parent needs to do is to choose carefully where you're willing to send your children. There are some great schools out there, but there are also schools that are going to transform your child in many cases in ways that you will find very unpleasant and demoralizing. Second of all, make sure that your son or daughter, when they go off to college, is warned by you and warned by your pastor and youth pastors about what they're going to face at college, the temptations they're going to face, the challenges to their faith, etc. I hope more churches, even the ones that don't want to get involved in politics, I hope they will at least start programs in their churches to prepare the young men and women in those churches to go off to school and be able to give a legitimate defense of the values, the faith-based values that church believes in.
But Gary, don't you think it's really hard for most 18-year-olds, 19-year-olds to stand up to someone with a PhD who's been arguing these things for years and kind of knows how to do it? It's almost impossible for them to stand up unless it's the really rare kid. And we've seen recently some of the YouTube videos with 12-year-olds and others who are saying things. But don't you think it's really, really, really hard, and that parents ought to, of course, I'm sitting here at Ohio Christian University, and we work so hard to have an appropriate, honest, truthful discussion of all issues, but particularly the traditional values. I just find it the rare kid that could go to a school who gets bombarded with that can withstand it. But that's just me.
I agree with you. It would be the rare student, but just letting that student know ahead of time that you're going to run into professors that are atheists, that are agnostics. They've got an agenda. They're going to try to destroy your particular faith-based worldview. Don't fall for that. I was actually thinking a little bit more, though, about the pressure believing young men and women are going to get on most of these campuses, even from fellow students. I mean, it's great if somebody sends their child to your university or someplace like Hillsdale or Grove City. There are good schools out there, but the great majority of students are going to end up in these schools that are very secular, and they're going to run into students that often have already bought into the secular worldview, and it's important that we do more to prepare them to resist that pressure.
Well, and I think one of the churches I was in did a great job with having seminars for our high school students and going through a lot of these things and bringing in good Christian experts, particularly, to explain to these children what they were going to see. And we saw a much better return on that sort of thing. Mm. Well, Gary, we're pretty much out of time. I want to tell you how much I appreciate you coming on the show and speaking to me and the listeners. I love your reasoned approach, and you've been someone standing out there for God and for families. And people who are interested in your organizations can come to our website, and we'll give the links. And just thank you so much for being on the show today.
Well, it's my pleasure. I've got a lot of interviews scheduled today, and I suspect this is going to be the only one I actually enjoy because the other ones are mostly hostile. So it was a pleasure to spend some time with you.
Thank you.
On behalf of our host, Dave Garrison, I'd like to thank you for listening to the Faith and Liberty Talk Show today. For additional information about the show, please go to faithandliberty.org, where you can access previous shows, like us on our Faith and Liberty Facebook page, and access other resources. Please keep in mind that the Faith and Liberty Talk Show exists only with the generosity and support of our listeners. If the show is of value to you, we would appreciate you visiting our website, faithandliberty.org, and donating to the show. The opinions and comments represent the views of our speakers and may or may not represent the views of Ohio Christian University. May God bless you, and thank you for listening to our show.